If anyone had told her that missing a bus would end with a Texas millionaire asking her to pretend to be his girlfriend, Leilani Cruz would have laughed and walked away. But that was exactly how the strangest night of her life began. The warm air of Honolulu hung heavy with the smell of salt and rain as Leilani hurried down the dim sidewalk, her worn sneakers slapping against the pavement after a long shift at a small oceanfront restaurant. She clutched her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders, glancing nervously toward the corner where the city bus usually stopped. The last bus home was the only way she could make it back to the tiny apartment she shared with her cousin across town. When she reached the stop, the street was empty except for the distant glow of taillights fading into the humid night. Her heart sank. The bus was gone. For a moment, she just stood there under the flickering street lamp, listening to the quiet hum of waves somewhere beyond the buildings. Missing that bus meant a long walk through unfamiliar streets, and tomorrow morning, she had to be at the diner before sunrise or risk losing the job that barely kept her afloat. Leilani let out a slow breath and dropped onto the wooden bench, staring at the dark road as light rain began to fall. Life had not been easy lately. Her mother back on the Big Island needed medical care that Leilani could barely help pay for, and every dollar she earned vanished into rent, food, and bus fare. Still, she tried to believe that kindness and hard work would eventually lead somewhere better. What she did not know was that the quiet street around her was about to become the beginning of a story she never imagined. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Now back to the night, everything changed. Leilani was about to stand and begin the long walk home when the deep rumble of an engine rolled down the street. A sleek black luxury car slowed beside the bus stop, its headlights cutting through the misty rain. Cars like that did not stop in places like this, especially not for someone like her. The passenger door opened, and a tall man stepped out. Even under the weak street light, she could tell he did not belong to this quiet corner of Honolulu. His suit was sharp, his posture confident, yet there was a strange urgency in his eyes as he looked around the empty street. For a brief moment their eyes met. Leilani instinctively looked away, assuming he had mistaken the stop for somewhere else. But instead of getting back into the car, the stranger walked directly toward her. Rain dotted his dark hair as he stopped a few feet from the bench. His voice was calm, but carried a seriousness that made her sit up straight. "I know this is going to sound unbelievable," he said slowly, "but I need your help tonight." Leilani blinked in confusion, unsure whether to laugh or stand up and leave. She had never seen this man before, yet something about the tension in his expression made the quiet night suddenly feel charged with possibility. The stranger studied her face for a second longer before saying the words that would turn her ordinary life upside down. "My name is Daniel Brooks," he said, "and I am willing to pay you a lot of money if you will pretend to be my girlfriend for the rest of this evening." Leilani stared at the man in disbelief, certain she had misunderstood what he had just said. The rain continued to fall lightly around them, tapping softly against the metal bench and the glossy hood of the black car behind him. "Pretend to be my girlfriend." The words echoed in her mind as she searched his face for some sign that this was a joke. But Daniel Brooks did not look amused. He looked serious, almost desperate. Leilani slowly stood from the bench, crossing her arms as she studied him carefully. "I am sorry," she said cautiously, "but I think you have the wrong person. I am just waiting for the bus." Daniel glanced briefly down the empty street before returning his attention to her. "I know exactly who you are," he replied calmly. "You are someone who looks honest, and right now I need someone honest more than anything else." That answer only made her more suspicious. She had lived in Honolulu long enough to know that wealthy strangers with luxury cars did not approach waitresses at bus stops with simple requests. There was always something more behind it. She shook her head slowly. "I do not pretend to be people," she said, "and I definitely do not pretend to be anyone's girlfriend." Daniel exhaled quietly and rubbed the back of his neck as if trying to choose his words carefully. "Look," he said, "I understand how strange this sounds. But I promise you I am not asking for anything inappropriate. I just need you to come with me to an event tonight and act like we are together. Nothing more." Leilani frowned. What kind of event requires a stranger from a bus stop to play girlfriend? Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. "A charity dinner at a resort a few miles from here. The kind of place where people care more about appearances than the truth." Leilani studied him again. Even under the dim street light, She could tell his suit probably cost more than 3 months of her rent. His watch reflected a flash of silver each time he moved his wrist. Everything about him screamed money and power, yet there was something tired behind his eyes, something almost human. Still, she was not convinced. "Why me?" she asked. "There are plenty of women in Honolulu who would happily go to a fancy dinner with a millionaire." Daniel gave a small, humorless smile. "Exactly," he said. "And that is the problem. Everyone at that dinner expects me to arrive with someone they recognize. Someone from the same wealthy circle. If I do that, the entire night turns into a business negotiation instead of what it is supposed to be." Leilani tilted her head. "And what is it supposed to be?" "A distraction," Daniel answered simply. He glanced toward the black car where a driver waited patiently behind the wheel. Then he looked back at her again. "If I show up with someone unexpected, someone genuine, people stop asking questions and start making assumptions. And assumptions are exactly what I need tonight." Leilani could not help letting out a small laugh. "So your solution is to pick a random girl who just missed the last bus?" Daniel nodded once. "Yes, and I am willing to compensate you for the inconvenience." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple business card, handing it to her. Leilani looked down at the card under the street light. The name Daniel Brooks was printed above the words Brooks. Energy Group, Texas. Even she recognized that name. The company had been mentioned on the news more than once. Her eyes widened slightly as she looked back up at him. "You are serious?" "Completely serious," he replied. Then he added gently, "I will also make sure you get home safely tonight. No long walk through dark streets." Leilani looked down the road again, thinking about the empty bus route, the rent she owed, and the hospital bills waiting back on the island for her mother. This was ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. And yet something about the calm certainty in Daniel Brooks's voice made it feel strangely possible. She looked back at him with narrowed eyes. "Just for tonight?" she said carefully. Daniel gave a small nod. "Just for tonight." Leilani held the business card between her fingers as the soft rain continued to fall around them, the thin piece of paper suddenly feeling far heavier than it should. Daniel Brooks waited patiently, giving her the space to decide, his calm expression almost unnerving. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The quiet street hummed with the distant sound of ocean waves and passing cars far away on the main road. Leilani finally slipped the card into her pocket and looked up at him again. "One night," she repeated carefully, her voice firm as if she needed to hear the rule out loud. "I go with you to this dinner, pretend to be your girlfriend, and then I go home. That is all." Daniel nodded immediately. "That is all." His answer came so quickly that she felt a strange mix of relief and suspicion at the same time. She studied his face again, searching for some hidden trick, but the only thing she saw was quiet determination. "Fine," she said at last, letting out a slow breath. "But if this turns into something weird, I am leaving." Daniel allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. "That is completely fair." He gestured politely toward the car behind him. "Then allow me to introduce you to the most comfortable ride you will probably ever take from a bus stop." Leilani hesitated for a moment before walking toward the sleek black car. The driver stepped out quickly and opened the rear door with practiced professionalism. Even that simple gesture made her feel out of place. She had never been inside a car like this before. The leather seats looked softer than the mattress in her small apartment. For a second, she wondered if she should remove her shoes before stepping inside. Daniel noticed her hesitation and spoke gently. "It is just a car," he said. "It only looks intimidating." Leilani gave a nervous laugh and climbed in, sitting carefully near the edge of the seat as if she might accidentally break something. Daniel followed, closing the door behind them. The quiet hum of the engine filled the space as the driver slowly pulled away from the curb and onto the rain-slick street. For the first minute, neither of them spoke. Leilani watched the glowing lights of Honolulu slide past the window while her thoughts raced. She could not believe she had agreed to this. Only 10 minutes earlier, she had been worrying about a long walk home in the rain. Now she was sitting beside a Texas millionaire in a luxury car heading to a resort dinner where she was supposed to pretend she belonged. Finally, she turned toward him. "So what exactly do I need to do tonight?" she asked. Daniel folded his hands calmly in his lap. "Very little," he replied. "Just be yourself and stay close to me. Most people at this dinner will already assume they know everything about us the moment they see us together." Leilani raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly will they assume?" Daniel glanced out the window for a moment before answering. that I finally decided to bring someone new into my life. Someone unexpected. She shook her head slowly. That still sounds crazy. Daniel nodded slightly as if he agreed. It probably is. But sometimes crazy solutions are the only ones that work. The car turned onto a long coastal road where palm trees swayed gently in the warm night wind. In the distance, the lights of a massive oceanfront resort glowed against the dark sky like something out of a movie. Leilani felt her stomach tighten as they approached the entrance. This place looked like it belonged to another world entirely. As the car rolled beneath the tall entrance canopy, she noticed several expensive vehicles parked outside and groups of elegantly dressed guests walking toward the brightly lit lobby. She looked down at her simple diner uniform and suddenly felt very small. Daniel followed her gaze and understood immediately. "Do not worry," he said softly. "We will fix that part before anyone sees you." The car stopped near a private side entrance where a woman in a dark suit waited with a garment bag in her hands. Daniel opened the door and stepped out before turning back toward Leilani. "Welcome to the most unexpected night of your life," he said quietly. And for the first time since leaving the bus stop, Leilani began to realize just how serious this strange agreement might become. Leilani stepped out of the car slowly, her eyes fixed on the towering entrance of the resort as warm golden lights reflected across the polished stone driveway. Everything about the place felt unreal. The air smelled faintly of tropical flowers and ocean breeze, and somewhere nearby soft music floated through the night like the soundtrack of a movie she had never expected to be part of. The woman waiting near the side entrance approached them with quiet efficiency, holding a long garment bag carefully over her arm. Daniel greeted her with a polite nod before turning toward Leilani. "This is Amanda," he explained calmly. "She helps manage events here." Amanda smiled warmly, though her eyes carried the quick professional awareness of someone used to dealing with very important guests. "It is nice to meet you, Miss Cruz," she said gently. "Daniel mentioned we might need to make a quick adjustment before the dinner begins." Leilani blinked in surprise. "He mentioned me." Daniel gave a small shrug. "I needed to make sure someone could help us if necessary." Amanda lifted the garment bag slightly. "I took the liberty of preparing something simple that should fit you. Nothing too dramatic. Just something that will help you feel comfortable walking into the ballroom." Leilani glanced down at her diner uniform and then back at the elegant building behind them. Comfortable might be impossible tonight, but she nodded anyway. Amanda led her through the quiet side entrance into a private dressing suite near the lobby. The room was softly lit and filled with mirrors framed by glowing lights. For a moment Leilani simply stood there, unsure where to move or what to touch. Amanda gently unzipped the garment bag and revealed a deep blue evening dress that shimmered faintly in the light. It looked elegant but not overly formal, the kind of dress that belonged in a world Leilani had only seen in magazines. Amanda held it up and smiled encouragingly. "I believe this will look beautiful on you." Leilani hesitated. "I cannot afford something like that if anything happens to it." Amanda shook her head softly. "You do not need to worry about that tonight." Daniel stepped back toward the hallway, giving them privacy. "Take your time," he said calmly. "I will be just outside." When the door closed behind him, Leilani looked back at the mirror and slowly changed into the dress. The fabric felt smooth and light against her skin, nothing like the stiff uniform she wore at work every day. When she finished and stepped in front of the mirror, she barely recognized the reflection staring back at her. Her dark hair had been brushed gently over one shoulder, and Amanda had added a small pair of earrings that caught the light each time she moved. For the first time that night, Leilani felt something unexpected rise in her chest. Not fear. Something closer to confidence. Amanda gave an approving nod. "There she is," she said softly. "The woman who will walk into that ballroom beside a Texas millionaire and make everyone wonder who she is." Leilani let out a nervous laugh. "That part is what worries me." Amanda smiled knowingly. "In my experience, the most interesting people in those rooms are the ones nobody expects to see." A few minutes later, Leilani stepped back into the hallway where Daniel was waiting near the entrance to the ballroom. When he turned and saw her, he paused for a moment in genuine surprise. The confident businessman who had calmly negotiated billion-dollar deals suddenly looked almost speechless. Leilani shifted awkwardly under his gaze. "Is something wrong?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "Nothing is wrong," he said quietly. "You just made this plan look a lot more convincing." From beyond the tall double doors they could hear the low murmur of conversation and the gentle clinking of glasses. The charity dinner had already begun. Daniel offered his arm politely. Ready to step into the story everyone in that room thinks they already understand. Leilani took a slow breath and slipped her arm through his. I guess tonight we find out how good I am at pretending. Daniel opened the doors, and together they stepped into a world that was about to watch their unexpected performance unfold. The moment Daniel and Leilani stepped into the ballroom, the soft murmur of conversation shifted almost instantly. The enormous room glowed with warm chandeliers that hung high above polished marble floors, reflecting golden light across tables covered in white linen and crystal glasses. Wealthy guests dressed in elegant suits and shimmering gowns turned subtly, their curious eyes following Daniel Brooks as he entered. But tonight something was different. Tonight he was not alone. Leilani felt every pair of eyes in the room brush across her like a sudden gust of wind. She tightened her grip slightly around Daniel's arm, hoping the nervous tremor in her fingers was not noticeable. Stay close, Daniel murmured quietly beside her, his voice calm and steady. That alone will answer most of their questions. Leilani nodded faintly, though her heart was beating faster with every step they took into the room. A man in a gray suit approached almost immediately, his smile wide, but his eyes calculating. Daniel, I was beginning to think you might skip the dinner entirely this year, he said smoothly before glancing toward Leilani. And who is this lovely surprise? Daniel did not hesitate. This is Leilani, he replied with calm confidence. Leilani, this is Richard Coleman. Richard runs the foundation hosting tonight's event. Richard extended his hand politely. It is a pleasure to meet you. Leilani managed a warm smile and shook his hand gently. The pleasure is mine. Richard studied her for a moment longer than necessary before nodding approvingly. Well, Daniel, it seems Hawaii has already started treating you well. Daniel responded with a light laugh before guiding Leilani deeper into the ballroom. As they moved through the crowd, more guests greeted him, each offering polite smiles mixed with unmistakable curiosity. Leilani noticed how quickly whispers followed them after each introduction. Clearly no one had expected Daniel Brooks to arrive with a mysterious woman from Honolulu. Then suddenly a sharper voice cut through the soft music. Daniel. The single word carried both surprise and something colder beneath it. Daniel slowed and turned slightly. Standing near the center table was a tall woman with sleek blonde hair and a perfectly tailored silver dress. Her posture was elegant but rigid, and her eyes locked onto Daniel with unmistakable intensity. Victoria Hale. Even Leilani could feel the tension in the air the moment the name left Daniel's lips. Victoria approached slowly, her heels clicking against the marble floor like tiny warning signals. For a moment, she did not even acknowledge Leilani. Her gaze stayed fixed on Daniel. I heard you were coming to Honolulu for business, she said smoothly. You forgot to mention you were bringing company. Daniel's voice remained calm. Victoria, this is Leilani. Leilani, this is Victoria Hale. Victoria's eyes finally moved toward Leilani, scanning her from head to toe with a polite smile that carried a sharp edge beneath it. How interesting, she said softly. Daniel usually keeps very predictable company. Leilani felt the subtle insult immediately, but instead of shrinking back, she simply held Victoria's gaze with quiet composure. Hawaii is full of surprises, she replied gently. Victoria blinked once, clearly not expecting the response. Daniel noticed the brief shift in her expression and almost smiled. Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying Leilani again. And how exactly did the two of you meet? Before Daniel could answer, Leilani spoke calmly. At a bus stop. Victoria raised an eyebrow as if she had misheard. I am sorry, did you say a bus stop? Daniel nodded casually. I missed a meeting earlier tonight and found something better instead. Victoria looked between them both, clearly trying to decide whether she was hearing the truth or an elaborate joke. Around them several nearby guests pretended not to listen while obviously paying close attention to every word. Finally Victoria let out a soft laugh. Well, Daniel, she said lightly, you certainly know how to keep people talking. She turned slightly, lifting her glass before walking away without another word. As she disappeared into the crowd, Leilani exhaled slowly. Was that part of the plan? She whispered. Daniel watched Victoria across the room before answering quietly. Not exactly, but you handled it perfectly. And as the music continued and the whispers around the ballroom grew louder, Leilani began to realize that pretending to belong in this world might be far more complicated than simply holding Daniel Brooks's arm. The music inside the ballroom continued to drift softly through the air, but the tension left behind by Victoria Hale lingered like an invisible cloud. Leilani remained beside Daniel, her posture calm even though her thoughts were racing. Guests continued to pass by their table, greeting Daniel with polite smiles. Yet many of them stole curious glances toward her when they believed she was not looking. After another brief conversation with a group of investors, Daniel gently leaned closer to her and spoke in a quiet voice. "Would you like some air?" Leilani nodded immediately. "Yes, please." They slipped away from the crowded ballroom through a glass door that opened onto a wide ocean terrace. The moment they stepped outside, the warm Hawaiian breeze wrapped around them like a comforting blanket. The distant sound of waves rolling against the shoreline replaced the hum of wealthy conversation. For the first time that evening, Leilani felt her shoulders relax. She walked slowly toward the stone railing that overlooked the dark ocean. The moon reflected faintly across the water, turning the waves into shifting silver lines. Daniel joined her beside the railing, resting his hands casually on the cool stone surface. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Finally Leilani let out a quiet breath. "That woman inside definitely did not expect to see me tonight." Daniel gave a faint smile. Victoria rarely expects surprises. She prefers situations she can control. Leilani glanced sideways at him. "Your former girlfriend." Daniel did not look surprised by the observation. "That obvious." Leilani shrugged lightly. "The way she said your name made it pretty clear." Daniel looked out toward the ocean again before speaking. "Victoria and I dated for a while several years ago. It ended when we realized our ambitions were far more compatible than our lives." Leilani studied him for a moment. "That sounds like a very polite way of saying it ended badly." Daniel laughed quietly. "You are very perceptive for someone who agreed to impersonate a stranger 10 minutes after meeting him at a bus stop." Leilani smiled slightly at that. "I'm still not sure why I agreed." Daniel turned his attention back to her. "I might have an idea." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh really?" Daniel nodded toward the distant city lights. People who struggle usually recognize struggle in others, even when the person wears an expensive suit. Leilani looked at him carefully, surprised by the honesty in his voice. "You do not look like someone who struggles." Daniel rested his elbows lightly on the railing and stared out over the ocean. "Appearances are a powerful illusion," he said quietly. "From the outside, it looks like everything in my life works perfectly. In reality, every decision I make is watched by investors, business partners, and people who believe they already know what I should do next." Leilani considered his words for a moment. "That sounds exhausting." "It is," Daniel admitted. Then he glanced back at her. "That is partly why tonight matters." Leilani tilted her head slightly. "Because of Victoria." "Partly," Daniel replied. "But also because people like Victoria assume they understand every move I make. When you walked into that ballroom with me tonight, every expectation in that room changed." Leilani laughed softly. "So I am your walking plot twist." Daniel smiled at the description. "Something like that." A comfortable silence settled between them as they both watched the ocean. After a moment Leilani spoke again, her voice quieter. "For what it is worth, I meant what I said earlier. At the bus stop." Daniel looked at her curiously. "About Hawaii being full of surprises." She nodded. "Tonight definitely proves that." Daniel studied her face in the moonlight, noticing the calm strength behind her eyes. Most people in that ballroom were trying to impress him, trying to gain something from his wealth or influence. But Leilani had simply spoken honestly from the moment they met. And somehow that honesty felt far more valuable than any business deal waiting inside that glittering room. After a moment Daniel straightened and gestured toward the doors. "We should probably return before people start inventing even stranger stories about us." Leilani smiled faintly. "I think they already have." As they walked back toward the ballroom, neither of them realized that what began as a simple performance was slowly becoming something neither of them had planned. When Daniel and Leilani stepped back into the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The music was still playing softly, and servers continued moving between tables with silver trays. But now there was a subtle tension in the air that had not been there before. Conversations paused just long enough for people to glance toward them, and Leilani could feel curiosity building like a quiet storm. Word had clearly spread during the few minutes they had spent outside. Daniel Brooks had arrived with a woman nobody recognized, and in a room full of people who believed they knew everything about one another, mystery was the most powerful form of gossip. Daniel guided Leilani toward their table near the front of the ballroom, where several business leaders were seated. As they approached, a tall man in a dark suit stood up slowly. His expression was polite but guarded, and his eyes lingered on Leilani with clear suspicion. "Daniel," the man said calmly, "I was wondering when you would return." Leilani noticed the way Daniel's posture shifted slightly as he greeted the man. There was respect there, but also a quiet tension. "Marcus Hale," Daniel said, extending his hand. "It is good to see you again." Marcus shook his hand firmly before turning his attention toward Leilani. "And you must be the unexpected guest everyone is talking about tonight." Daniel gestured politely. "Marcus, this is Leilani Cruz." "Leilani, this is Marcus Hale, the Chief Financial Officer of Brooks Energy Group." Marcus nodded slowly. The Chief Financial Officer. The title alone made Leilani realize this man likely knew everything about Daniel's business and probably about his personal life as well. Marcus studied her carefully before speaking again. "I do not believe we have met before." Leilani met his gaze calmly. "That is because we have not." Marcus allowed a faint smile, though it did not quite reach his eyes. Daniel usually introduces important people in his life long before they appear at events like this. Daniel responded before the tension could grow further. "Leilani and I met very recently." Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together. Recently can mean many things. The silence around the table grew heavier. Several nearby guests pretended to focus on their drinks while clearly listening to every word. Leilani could sense the challenge in Marcus's tone, but instead of retreating, she spoke with quiet confidence. "Sometimes the most important people enter your life when you least expect them." Marcus's eyebrows lifted slightly, clearly surprised by the answer. Daniel watched the exchange with quiet interest, noticing how naturally Leilani held her ground in a room that intimidated even experienced executives. Marcus finally nodded once. "That is certainly a poetic way of describing a relationship that began only hours ago." Daniel remained calm. "Marcus, tonight is a charity event, not a corporate investigation." Marcus gave a short laugh. "Of course. My apologies. I am simply accustomed to understanding all developments related to our company's public image." Leilani suddenly realized something important. In Marcus's mind, she was not just a stranger. She was a variable. Something unexpected that could affect Daniel's reputation and possibly the company's future. The dinner service began shortly afterward, and for a while the conversation shifted toward business projects and international investments. Yet Leilani noticed that Marcus continued observing her throughout the evening with quiet calculation. At one point he leaned closer to Daniel and spoke quietly, though not quietly enough that Leilani could not hear the edge in his voice. "You should be careful with surprises, Daniel. They can become complications very quickly." Daniel's expression remained calm, but his answer carried firm confidence. "Some surprises turn out to be exactly what people need." Marcus did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward Leilani once more before returning his attention to his glass. But across the ballroom, another pair of eyes had also been watching the entire conversation unfold. Victoria Hale stood near the bar, speaking with a group of investors. Yet her gaze occasionally drifted back toward Daniel and the mysterious woman who had suddenly entered his world. And while the rest of the guests believed they were simply witnessing a harmless romantic story unfolding at a charity dinner, a quiet chain of suspicions had already begun forming behind the polite smiles of people who understood that power and reputation were rarely simple things. The dinner slowly moved into its final stage as the last plates were cleared and the soft music shifted into a quieter melody meant for conversation and reflection. Yet beneath the elegant surface of the evening, tension continued to build around Daniel and Leilani like an invisible current. Leilani could feel it each time someone glanced toward their table, whispering quietly before pretending to return their attention to the speeches and polite applause. She had entered the ballroom as a stranger, but now she had become the most discussed person in the room. Daniel seemed to notice the growing pressure as well. After the charity organizer finished a short speech thanking the donors, he leaned closer to Leilani and spoke softly. "I think you have survived the most difficult part of the evening." Leilani gave a small smile. "That depends on how many more people plan to question my existence tonight." Daniel let out a quiet laugh. Most of them are simply trying to decide whether you are a temporary mystery or a permanent one. The event slowly began to dissolve into smaller groups of conversation as guests moved around the ballroom. Daniel guided Leilani toward a quieter corner near a large window that overlooked the ocean. From there, the lights of Honolulu shimmered in the distance like scattered stars across the coastline. For the first time since entering the ballroom, they were able to speak without an audience listening to every word. "You handled tonight better than most people in my business world would have," Daniel said calmly. Leilani crossed her arms lightly and leaned against the window frame. "I grew up helping my mother run a small food stand on the island. When you serve hundreds of strangers every week, you learn how to stay calm when people stare at you." Daniel studied her expression with genuine interest. "You never mentioned that earlier." Leilani shrugged. "There was not much time for life stories at the bus stop." Daniel nodded slightly. "That is true." A quiet moment passed between them before Leilani spoke again. "So what happens now?" Daniel looked toward the ballroom, where Marcus Hale was still speaking with several investors, and Victoria Hale stood near the bar with a polite but distant smile. "Tonight ends the same way it began," he said calmly. "We leave, people speculate about what they think they saw, and eventually the rumors settle into whatever version of the story makes them comfortable." Leilani considered his words. "And tomorrow?" Daniel paused briefly before answering. "Tomorrow depends on whether you still believe this arrangement was worth your time." Leilani looked at him curiously. "You mean the pretending part?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, because what happened tonight solved a problem for me, but it also created new questions for everyone else in that room." Leilani followed his gaze across the ballroom. "I noticed the man you introduced earlier did not look very comfortable with those questions." "Marcus Hale rarely enjoys surprises," Daniel replied calmly. "As chief financial officer, he prefers every detail of my life to be predictable." Leilani smiled slightly. "That sounds exhausting." Daniel returned the smile. "You are beginning to understand why tonight mattered." A server passed nearby offering glasses of sparkling water, and Daniel took two, handing one to Leilani. For a moment, they stood quietly beside the window looking out at the ocean. Finally, Leilani spoke again. "I agreed to help you for one evening, but I cannot help wondering something." Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "What is that?" She met his gaze directly. "Did you choose me only because I was convenient, or because you trusted me?" Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied her expression carefully, as if measuring the weight of the question. Then he spoke with quiet honesty. "When I saw you sitting alone at that bus stop, you looked like someone who would not pretend to be something she was not. That is rare in my world." Leilani looked down at the glass in her hands, absorbing his words. Outside the window, the waves continued to roll gently against the shoreline as the night moved forward. Inside the ballroom, the guests continued their conversations, unaware that the simple agreement made beside a quiet Honolulu bus stop was slowly turning into something neither Daniel nor Leilani had expected when their paths first crossed. The ballroom slowly began to thin as the evening moved toward its final hour. Some guests gathered near the exit while others lingered around small circles of conversation, their voices low and polite. Yet the quiet storm of speculation surrounding Daniel Brooks and the mysterious woman beside him had not faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. Leilani could feel it each time someone passed their table and glanced in their direction with curiosity that was almost impossible to hide. Daniel seemed calm, but she could tell his mind was working behind that composed expression. After a moment, he stood and offered his hand to her. "I think it is time we make one more appearance before we leave," he said quietly. Leilani raised an eyebrow. "One more appearance?" Daniel nodded toward the center of the ballroom, where the charity organizer had set up a small stage near the front. Several people were gathering there as another short announcement prepared to begin. "If we disappear too quietly," Daniel explained, "people will invent their own ending to the story." Leilani gave a small laugh. "I have a feeling they already have." Daniel smiled faintly. "Probably, but we can still guide the final chapter tonight." He led her gently through the ballroom toward the stage area, just as the host invited Daniel to say a few words about the foundation project Brooks Energy Group had helped sponsor earlier that year. Applause followed as Daniel stepped onto the small stage. Leilani remained nearby, suddenly very aware that dozens of eyes had turned toward them again. Daniel spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had addressed crowds many times before. He thanked the foundation for its worked supporting education programs across several islands, and spoke briefly about the importance of creating opportunities for communities that were often overlooked. His words were sincere and measured, and the audience listened with polite attention. But then something unexpected happened. As Daniel finished speaking, he paused, glancing toward Leilani before continuing. "Tonight I was reminded of something important," he said. "Sometimes the most meaningful moments in life happen when you least expect them." The room grew slightly quieter as guests leaned forward with curiosity. Daniel continued calmly. "A few hours ago I was reminded that the world is still full of honest people who do not care about titles, reputations, or business strategies. People who simply choose to help when someone asks." Several people exchanged curious looks as he spoke. Daniel then gestured gently toward Leilani. "Tonight I had the privilege of attending this event with someone who reminded me of that simple truth." Leilani felt her cheeks warm as the room turned toward her. She had not expected to become part of the evening in such a public way. Daniel finished his short speech with a polite thank you and stepped down from the stage as the audience applauded once more. Yet the applause carried a different tone now. It was mixed with fascination, with speculation, and in some cases with quiet disbelief. As Daniel returned to her side, Leilani spoke softly. "That was not part of the plan." Daniel gave a small shrug. "Neither was meeting you." Across the room, Marcus Hale watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, clearly calculating how this unexpected development might affect the company narrative in the coming days. Near the bar, Victoria Hale held her glass carefully, her polite smile fixed in place while her gaze followed Daniel and Leilani with unmistakable intensity. The story had just taken a turn nobody in that ballroom had predicted. When Daniel and Leilani finally walked toward the exit, the whispers behind them were louder than before. Outside the resort, the warm night air welcomed them once again as the car waited near the entrance. Leilani looked back toward the glowing ballroom windows where dozens of conversations were already reshaping what they believed they had witnessed. Tonight had begun with a simple agreement beside a quiet bus stop. But now it had become something much larger, something neither of them could fully control anymore. And as Daniel opened the car door for her, Leilani could not shake the feeling that the performance they had created together was only the beginning of a story that was about to grow far more complicated. The car pulled away from the glowing resort entrance and rolled smoothly onto the quiet coastal road. For a few minutes, neither Daniel nor Leilani spoke. The sound of the ocean drifted through the slightly open window, mixing with the low hum of the engine. Inside the car, the silence felt heavier than before. The performance they had created inside the ballroom had ended, but the consequences of that performance were only beginning. Leilani watched the dark shoreline pass by through the window while replaying the evening in her mind. Only a few hours earlier, she had been sitting alone at a bus stop worrying about missing the last ride home. Now she had just stood in front of some of the most powerful people in the business world while Daniel Brooks introduced her as someone important in his life. Finally, she spoke quietly. "That speech you gave inside changed things." Daniel kept his gaze forward for a moment before answering. "Yes, it did." Leilani turned slightly toward him. "People are going to believe we are really together now." Daniel nodded slowly. "That was the intention." Leilani looked back toward the distant lights of the resort growing smaller behind them. "I thought the plan was just one evening." Daniel remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. "Originally it was." Leilani felt a small knot tighten in her chest. "Originally." Daniel sighed softly and leaned back against the seat. "When I asked you for help tonight, I needed a simple distraction. Something that would redirect attention away from certain business negotiations happening around me. But after what happened inside that ballroom, the story has grown larger than that." Leilani studied him carefully. "Larger how?" Daniel turned his head slightly to meet her gaze. "Marcus Hale will spend the next few days investigating who you are and why you suddenly appeared beside me. Victoria Hale will do the same for very different reasons. And the investors who were watching tonight will assume that any woman I introduce publicly might become part of my future decisions." Leilani let out a quiet breath. "So pretending to be your girlfriend for one evening just turned into something bigger." Daniel gave a faint nod. "Yes." The car slowed as they approached a quiet overlook where the road curved along the edge of the ocean cliffs. Daniel raised his hand slightly, and the driver pulled to the side. The engine softened to a low idle as the waves crashed gently against the rocks below. Daniel opened the door and stepped out into the warm night air. Leilani followed, wrapping her arms lightly around herself as the breeze moved through the palm trees nearby. They walked toward the railing overlooking the dark water. The moon reflected across the ocean, turning the waves into shifting silver shapes. Daniel rested his hands against the railing and looked out across the horizon before speaking. I owe you honesty after everything you handled tonight. Leilani remained quiet, waiting. The reality is that many people in my world expect my life to follow a very predictable path. Strategic partnerships, carefully planned relationships, public appearances that support business goals. Tonight broke that pattern completely. Leilani leaned against the railing beside him. Because I came from a bus stop. Daniel gave a small smile. Exactly. And because of that, people will spend the next several days trying to understand you. Trying to understand us. Leilani watched the waves for a moment before speaking again. And what does that mean for me? Daniel turned toward her, his expression thoughtful but sincere. It means that if we suddenly disappear from each other's lives tomorrow, people will assume the entire evening was a mistake. But if we continue the story a little longer, the questions will fade naturally. Leilani raised an eyebrow. Continue the story. Daniel nodded slowly. Just for a short time. Long enough for the rumors to settle and the attention to shift somewhere else. Leilani looked out across the ocean again, considering the strange path her night had taken. Hours ago she had agreed to pretend for one evening. Now she was standing beside a Texas millionaire discussing whether their fictional relationship should continue. She let out a quiet laugh that carried both disbelief and curiosity. You realize this might be the strangest job offer anyone has ever given me. Daniel smiled slightly. I suspected you might say that. Then he added gently, but I would not ask if I did not believe you could handle it. The waves continued to roll quietly against the rocks below as Leilani stood. They're thinking. Somewhere deep down she knew that agreeing to continue this strange arrangement might pull her further into a world far more complicated than she had ever imagined. And yet something about Daniel's honesty made the decision feel less like a trap and more like the beginning of an unexpected journey neither of them had planned. Leilani remained quiet for a long moment as the sound of the ocean filled the night around them. The wind moved gently across the cliffs, carrying the steady rhythm of waves crashing far below. Daniel stood beside her at the railing, giving her the space to think, knowing that the choice he had just placed in front of her was not a small one. Finally, Leilani let out a slow breath and looked toward him again. If we continue this story, she said carefully, how long are we talking about? Daniel considered the question. Long enough for people to lose interest. In my world, attention moves quickly. A few public appearances together. A few photographs that confirm the narrative people already believe. Then eventually life moves forward and the curiosity fades. Leilani studied his expression, trying to decide whether she trusted what she saw there. You make it sound simple. Daniel shook his head slightly. It will not be simple, but it will be temporary. She leaned against the railing again and looked out over the ocean. Back home on the island, her mother was probably already asleep, unaware that her daughter was standing beside one of the most powerful businessmen in Texas discussing how to pretend to be part of his life. The entire situation felt unreal, like something that belonged in a story instead of real life. And yet everything about this moment was real. After another quiet minute, she spoke again. If I agree to this, I have conditions. Daniel turned toward her with a faint smile. I expected that. Leilani raised one finger slightly. First, I am not changing who I am. I am not pretending to be someone from your world. If people ask where I came from, they get the truth. I met you at a bus stop. Daniel nodded immediately. That is one of the reasons this arrangement works. The truth is far more convincing than any invented story. Leilani lifted another finger. Second, my family stays out of this. My mother does not need reporters showing up on our island asking questions. Daniel's expression grew more serious. That will not happen. I will make sure of it. She looked at him carefully. You have that kind of power. Daniel gave a quiet answer. Sometimes power is useful for protecting people. Leilani lowered her hand slowly. And the last condition. Daniel waited. She met his gaze directly. When this arrangement ends, it ends honestly. No disappearing without explanation. No pretending we never met. Daniel looked at her for several seconds before speaking. That is fair. Then he added quietly, I would not want this story to end that way either. The driver remained near the car while the two of them stood beside the cliff road, giving them privacy under the moonlit sky. Finally, Daniel extended his hand toward her. Then we have an agreement. Leilani looked down at his hand for a moment before shaking it gently. Just for a short time, she said. Daniel nodded. Just long enough for the world to stop asking questions. They both knew that the agreement they had just made was simple in theory, but unpredictable in reality. Daniel had spent years controlling every aspect of his public image, yet now he had invited someone completely outside his world to stand beside him. And Leilani had spent her life working quietly to support her family, yet now she was stepping into a spotlight that could change everything. As they walked back toward the car, Leilani glanced up at the stars scattered across the Hawaiian sky. Something about the moment felt strangely important, as if the decision she had just made would lead her down a path she could never fully undo. Daniel opened the car door for her again, and this time she stepped inside without hesitation. The driver started the engine, and the car pulled away from the overlook, returning to the quiet coastal highway. Neither of them spoke for the first few minutes of the drive. But somewhere between the sound of the ocean and the glow of distant city lights, a quiet understanding had formed between them. What began as a simple favor at a bus stop had now become a shared secret. A carefully constructed story that the world would soon believe was real. And neither of them could yet see how far that story was about to take them. The next morning the quiet streets of Honolulu woke slowly beneath the golden light of sunrise, but inside the world of business and media the night before had already begun turning into headlines and speculation. By the time Leilani finished her early shift at the small oceanfront diner, the whispers had already reached places she never expected. A television mounted above the counter played a local morning news segment, and for a moment she froze when a photograph from the charity dinner appeared on the screen. There she was, standing beside Daniel Brooks near the ballroom stage, wearing the deep blue dress and looking far more confident than she had felt. The headline beneath the image read that the Texas energy billionaire had been spotted with a mysterious woman during his visit to Honolulu. Several customers in the diner leaned closer to watch the story, curious but unaware that the woman serving coffee only a few feet away was the same person in the photograph. Leilani kept her composure and continued working, but inside she felt the strange weight of the decision she had made the night before. After her shift ended, she stepped outside into the warm morning air and found a black car waiting across the street. Daniel stepped out as she approached, dressed more casually than the night before, but carrying the same calm presence. I see the news travels quickly, he said gently. Leilani crossed her arms and gave him a half-amused look. You were not kidding about the rumors. Daniel nodded slightly. This is exactly why we agreed to continue the story. The sooner people see us together again, the sooner it becomes normal instead of mysterious. Leilani studied him for a moment. So what is the next chapter of our story supposed to look like? Daniel gestured toward the car. Lunch by the harbor. Somewhere public enough that people can see us, but relaxed enough that you do not feel like you are standing on a stage. She hesitated for only a second before getting into the car beside him. The driver pulled away and guided them through the bright streets toward the waterfront district where fishing boats and tourist shops lined the harbor. When they arrived at a small open-air restaurant overlooking the water, several people recognized Daniel immediately. Cameras appeared from nearby tables, and quiet murmurs followed them as they walked to their seats. Leilani felt the attention again, but this time she was ready for it. Daniel noticed the shift in her confidence and gave a small approving smile. You are adapting quickly. She picked up the menu and shrugged lightly. When you grow up in a place where everyone knows your name, you learn to ignore people staring. Their lunch passed in a calm rhythm of conversation and ocean breeze. For the first time since the strange agreement began, they spoke less about the plan and more about their lives. Daniel told her about growing up in Texas and building his company from a small operation into an international business. Leilani shared stories about the island where she had grown up, about helping her mother serve food to fishermen and tourists, and about the quiet pride she felt every time she sent money home to help her family. As the afternoon sun reflected across the harbor water, something unexpected began to grow between them. The pretending that had begun as a simple arrangement started to feel less like an act and more like a shared experience. When they finally stood to leave the restaurant, several cameras captured the moment as Daniel gently placed his hand at the small of Leilani's back while guiding her toward the car. The photographs would soon appear across news websites and social media feeds, confirming what people had already begun to believe. The Texas millionaire and the woman from Honolulu were clearly together. As the car pulled away from the harbor, Leilani glanced at Daniel and shook her head with quiet disbelief. Yesterday I was worried about missing a bus. Today the entire internet thinks I am dating a billionaire. Daniel looked out toward the passing shoreline and smiled faintly. Life has a strange way of surprising people. But neither of them yet realized that the story they had just made public would soon force them to confront feelings that no contract or agreement could easily explain. Over the next several days, the story that began beside a quiet Honolulu bus stop spread far beyond the island. Photographs of Daniel Brooks and the mysterious woman beside him appeared across business news websites and entertainment pages alike. Commentators speculated endlessly about the woman who had suddenly appeared in the life of the Texas energy billionaire. Some called it a romantic surprise. Others called it a calculated move. But none of them knew the simple truth that it had all started because one tired waitress missed the last bus home. At first, Leilani tried to ignore the attention. She continued working at the small diner near the beach and returned to her modest apartment each evening as if nothing had changed. But the world around her had clearly noticed. Customers began whispering when they recognized her from the photographs. Tourists occasionally asked for pictures. Even the diner owner watched the news with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Meanwhile, Daniel kept his word. He visited Honolulu frequently during the following weeks, always choosing simple places to meet Leilani instead of glamorous restaurants. They walked along the harbor, shared meals at small food stands, and talked for hours about their completely different lives. At first, their meetings were part of the agreement they had made beside the ocean cliff. Appear together. Let the rumors settle. Allow the world to believe the story was real. But slowly something unexpected began to change. The more time they spent together, the less it felt like an arrangement. Daniel found himself looking forward to the quiet honesty in Leilani's voice after long days of business meetings. Leilani discovered that behind the polished confidence of a powerful businessman was a man who rarely had the chance to simply be himself. Weeks passed, and the speculation surrounding them slowly lost its urgency. New headlines replaced the old ones. Investors returned their focus to business matters. Marcus Hale stopped investigating Leilani's background when it became clear she had nothing to hide. Even Victoria Hale eventually turned her attention toward other social circles where Daniel Brooks was no longer the center of her interest. One evening, as the sun began to set across the ocean, Daniel asked Leilani to meet him again near the same quiet bus stop where they had first spoken. When she arrived, the street looked almost exactly as it had that first night. The same bench, the same flickering street lamp, the same distant sound of waves moving through the darkness. Daniel stood beside the bench, holding something small in his hand. Leilani approached with a curious smile. "Do not tell me you are asking for another favor," she said lightly. Daniel shook his head and laughed softly. "No more favors. This time I came to tell the truth." She tilted her head slightly. "The truth about what?" Daniel gestured toward the bench. "About how the best thing that ever happened to me started right here when you missed a bus." He held out his hand and revealed a small silver ring that reflected the soft streetlight. "When we first met," he said quietly, "we were pretending for the world. But somewhere along the way I stopped pretending." Leilani stared at the ring for a moment, stunned by the unexpected turn the evening had taken. Daniel took a slow breath and continued. "I know our story started in the strangest way possible, but every day since then I have realized something important. The woman who sat on this bench that night is exactly the person I want beside me for the rest of my life." The quiet street seemed to pause as Leilani absorbed his words. Then she smiled, the same warm smile that had first caught his attention beneath the dim bus stop light. "I guess missing that bus turned out to be the best mistake I ever made." Daniel slipped the ring gently onto her finger as the ocean breeze moved softly through the palm trees nearby. And in that quiet moment, the story that had once been nothing more than a simple act of pretending finally became something real. A reminder that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can change two lives forever.